Good morning, Aurora. Welcome back to Quarantine Coffee and Jesus. Today we're finishing up chapter 4 of Colossians. We've been in chapter 4 all week, and so we're finishing that up, which means we are finishing Colossians, and that is the second book that we have studied through in this quarantine. So I just want to say great job. Thanks for sticking with us through it. Hopefully you guys have gotten as much out of it as I have. I realized this week when I was studying this that this is the most time I have spent like in the Bible, reading it, like studying it word by word in a really long time, if I'm being honest. It's been a long time since I've done that, and for that I'm just really grateful to the quarantine and to the situation. That's one thing I'm really grateful about, and so just wanted to share that. Our awesome interns, Jamie and Johanna, are the ones that have been organizing this study. They're the ones who kind of assign the sections that we're going to teach on, and they keep us on track. If you watched Jamie's video on Monday, she said that they've been giving Cole like the harder sections to teach, or like the harder topics to teach on, and I'm just going to beg to differ today. So last week I read ahead to the section that I would be doing, and do you want my honest initial reaction? So you know when you go visit your sweet senile grandpa for that like obligatory semi-annual visit, and he kind of like insists that you come over and sit by him uncomfortably close after a few cups of coffee that he's had. And then unsolicited, he starts telling you a story, one that you've probably heard 2,700 times, but you have to endure it anyways, again. And while he's like spinning this tale, he's naming a bunch of random names, as if you're supposed to know who they are, right? But you've never heard of them. He doesn't give you a ton of context or backstory about them, but they seem important enough to be in the story. And maybe if you knew more about them, then it would all make sense and it would mean more. That's how I felt reading these verses that we're gonna read. But stick with me, okay? Because it's good. But at first I was like, really, guys? Like, you gave me the list of names? Cool, thanks. But the more I like dug into it, it really taught me a lot. And it's actually just pretty cool to learn about Paul and like his friendships and his relationships and the things that he went through with these people. So let's jump in. Yesterday, Dan went through verses 7 through 9 of chapter 4, which was talking about the two guys that Paul was going to send to Colossae to update the Colossians about what had been going on, to deliver this letter that Paul has written to them. And he mentions Tychicus, which I just like saying that name, who's delivering the letter to the Colossians. And he was also the one who delivered Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And so, as Dan so lovingly named him, he's the mailman. He's like the glorified mailman. He's trusted. And then going with Tychicus to deliver this was Onesimus. And if you haven't listened to Dan's talk from yesterday, it's so good. And I highly encourage you to check it out. You'll get to know all about this Onesimus guy. And it ties into a little bit of what I'll be talking through today. But what I found so admirable and quite frankly convicting is that Paul's goal is not only to inform the Colossians about what's going on with him, and also to like admonish them and talk to them about like this false teaching issue that they're walking through, but it's also to encourage them. Like he says it in those verses in verse 8, I have sent him to you for this very purpose, that you may know how we are and that he may encourage your hearts. And so Paul's goal is really to encourage them. And even from prison, it just struck me that like he's concerned about their hearts and their well-being, even though his situation really sucks. And so that was really convicting for me. So now that you're up to speed, let's keep reading. We're going to start in verse 10 and go through to the end of verse 18. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And Jesus, who is called Justus. These are the only men of the circumcision among my fellow workers for the kingdom of God, and they have been a comfort to me. Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ Jesus, greets you, always struggling on your behalf in his prayers, that you may stand mature and fully assured in all the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has worked hard for you and for those in Laodicea and in Hierapolis. Luke, the beloved physician, greets you, as does Demas. Give my greetings to the brothers at Laodicea and to Nympha and the church in her house. And when this letter has been read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and see that you also read the letter from Laodicea. And say to Archippus, see that you fulfill the ministry that you have received in the Lord. I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. Remember my chains. Grace be with you. Okay, so Paul is now sending greetings kind of from his circle of people to the Colossians. He starts with Aristarchus, who was a Jewish Christian. He was Paul's travel buddy and was with him during some pretty crazy moments, including being seized by an angry Ephesian mob that we read about in Acts. It's actually like a crazy story. They like drag these guys into this huge theater, and everyone's telling Paul not to go in there because the same thing is going to happen to him. Wild. Read it in Acts. And Aristarchus also accompanied Paul on his journey to Rome, where he would be thrown in prison, which is where he is now. So Paul calls Aristarchus a fellow prisoner, and I'm not sure whether that is literal. And Aristarchus, I'm going to call him Ari. Do we mind? Are we cool with that? Because it's just a lot to say. Ari. So I'm not sure whether that is literal and Ari is also in jail, or if it's more of a metaphor for being a prisoner of Christ, because he calls him a fellow prisoner. Either way, they've been through some pretty tough stuff and have experienced a wild ride together. Ari is what you would call like a ride or die friend. He was there through it all and never left his side. And then Paul mentions Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, may be coming to them, and he instructs the Colossians to welcome him or to take care of him, show him around, show him like where to eat, make sure he has a place to stay, that kind of thing. But what's really interesting to note about this is that Paul and Mark and Barnabas all used to be in ministry together back in the day, but Mark pretty much bailed on Paul during their first ministry journey. We aren't sure why Mark bailed. I got a little off on a tangent when I was thinking about this. I thought maybe he got tired of all the walking like I would, or being on the road all the time. Like road life is hard. Or maybe he got sick, or he got hurt, like injured, hurt his leg or something, and didn't think that he could continue. Or maybe he missed his girlfriend back home and just wanted to be back with her. Like, who knows? All we know is that he bailed on Paul, and Paul was really hurt by it and felt abandoned. So Mark bails, and Paul and Barnabas continue on their ministry tour. They're traveling to all these cities together, sharing Jesus with people. And then they get in this strong disagreement, we will call it, because Barnabas wanted to invite Mark back on the road with them for the second tour. So remember, they're cousins, Barnabas and Mark. And Barnabas wants Mark to come back on their second tour together. And Paul was like, no, remember when he bailed on us because he couldn't hang anymore? He couldn't handle it. And I don't trust him to not do the same thing to us again. So why would we invite him? So they both felt pretty strongly about their positions on this matter, and neither of them would budge on it. And so it ended up at this impasse. And ultimately they decided to go their separate ways, and the band broke up. So Barnabas went one way and did ministry, and then Paul went another way. So they both stayed in ministry, and there was no moral failure. There was no big thing that caused this fallout, but there was a bit of a fallout. So back to what we're reading, the fact that Paul is now mentioning Mark as his fellow worker and asking the Colossians to take good care of him tells us that they've reconciled, right? So time has passed, wounds have healed, people change. There's nothing like a little prison time or a quarantine to kind of make you realize what's important or who's important, and like the stupid stuff that we've been hung up on or upset about. And I wonder if Paul realized that it would be hypocritical for him to be preaching grace and reconciliation, right? Writing this letter to Philemon to like reconcile with his runaway slave, without mending his side of the fence too, without fixing his relationships. So that was interesting to note about him mentioning Mark. So then he mentions this Jesus Justice guy. He says, and Jesus, who is called Justice. So I don't know if it's like first name Jesus, last name Justice or what, but let's just call him Justice for now. He mentions him, and we know next to nothing about this guy, other than he was a valued like Jewish associate or friend of Paul's, and that he was a great comfort to him. So that's all we really know about him. Paul says that those three guys are the only men of circumcision or men of Jewish heritage that are in his inner circle. And the whole reason Paul is in prison right now is because of the Jewish riot that happened after he preached that grace was available to Jews and Gentiles. The Jews went crazy, basically thinking that was heresy. So I'm thinking maybe he throws in the comment of like, these are the only three like Jewish friends that I have, to point out that he was like not highly favored by the Jewish people right now. So the next up in the roster, he talks about Epaphras, right, who was from Colossae actually, but was now in Rome serving with Paul. And so we can assume from Colossians chapter 1, which we went through a few weeks ago, that Epaphras probably started the church in Colossae and used to be the pastor or like a pastoral figure to them before he went to Rome. So it's good for them to hear a word from Epaphras, right? It's good to know, like, okay, he's still alive. Paul mentioned him. He's still alive and well. So he says, Paul tells them that Epaphras says, hey, or what up, if he's anything like Cole. He just sends a quick, like, what up? And then Paul tells us that Epaphras is always struggling on your behalf in his prayers, which makes sense, right? Since Epaphras is the one who told Paul his concerns about the false teachings that were going on in Colossae. He obviously loves this church and these people a ton, and he prays to the point, it says, to the point of pain and discomfort for them, which tells us that loving and caring for people really well equals praying for them really well, like to the point of anguish, kind of like Jesus prayed in the garden before he was crucified. It's this like deep interceding for the people that you love. And what does Epaphras pray for? It says that he prays that they would stand mature and fully assured in all the will of God. Which I was like, that's a heck of a prayer. It's only a few words. It's super simple, but it's really powerful. And I started to think about my prayer life and if it would ever be described that same way. Like, am I praying for people to the point of pain? Am I working so hard on their behalf through prayer? And yes, like when I know of a very serious or emergency situation, I'm absolutely praying and pleading with the Lord for them, praying for healing or deliverance or whatever that is. Like, I'm absolutely doing that. But I think that we're called to pray that way all the time for the little things and the big things and people in our like close inner circle, and then people kind of in the wider circles, our church, our neighbors, our community. And right now we have the time. Like, if we're honest, we have time to pray that way right now. We know that the Lord hears our prayers and that he's listening and interceding at the right hand of God. We read that, I think it was earlier in Colossians. So that was really challenging for me. And then Paul sends some greetings from Luke the physician, or Dr. Luke, if you will. This is the same Luke that wrote the Gospel of Luke, and he also wrote the book of Acts. And that kind of makes sense because if you go and read Luke or Acts. It's got more of like a analytical, scientific vibe to it. And Luke traveled with Paul quite a bit and was with him during a couple of his imprisonments. It's been thought that maybe Luke was there with Paul in Rome delivering those 2 books that he wrote. And then Paul briefly mentions Demas by saying, like, all he says is, and does Demas, like, that's all he says. And he may or may not be throwing some shade by giving him just 3 words when he talks about him. But since he gets mentioned, it seems that he was definitely considered among Paul's like circle of people or influential people at the time. Later in Timothy, we read that Paul says that Demas has forsaken him, having loved the present world, is what he says. And so I was thinking, I'm like, man, Paul's been through the ringer when it comes to friendships and betrayal. Guys that he thought had his back and that we're going to be in this ministry with him and we're in this fight with him, gave up on him and chose the world over ministry, chose like the old life over ministry. And I think a lot of us can probably relate to a bit of that. You know, we've lost friendships that we thought were going to last a lifetime. And we've seen people we love with really strong faiths and relationships with Jesus step back into old habits and choose what the world says is best. And it's heartbreaking. And Paul gets that. And you can tell through his writing that, like, he's sad about that. I think he's got a little bit of like a stiff upper lip about it, and he's kind of like still salty about it, but he's hurt. And so Paul starts to wrap things up by asking his readers to send his love to the people in Laodicea, I think I'm saying that right, and to Nymphis and the church in her house. So my version says her house, and other translations say his house. So it's not clear as to whether Paul was referring to Nymphis, the man, or Nympha, the woman. But it's not like super important in this context. What I love is that we're reminded. So he says, let me read it directly. Give my greetings to the brothers at Laodicea and to Nympha and the church in her house. So we're reminded by those words that the early church was not held in buildings or auditoriums or movie theaters or old Walmarts and Albertsons, or even a high school, right? Like they had house churches, which were a lot like house parties, but with less drugs and less alcohol and more worship and teaching. Although there was wine a lot of the time, so forget what I said about alcohol. There was just less drugs. And there was probably dancing. Anyway, house churches. Since houses were not particularly big in that area or that time, they had multiple house churches in one city. Like, does that sound familiar? A group of 10 to 15 people meeting up in somebody's house, having some food and talking about life and Jesus and how to do this life thing with Jesus, right? Like, that's exactly what groups at Flatirons are modeled after. It's what we've been doing for 3 years now, and it's what we do virtually every week now in our homes. And it's so cool for me to sit here and think, like, dang, we are kicking it super old school and doing church the way that the early Christians did it. Like, that's, to me, that's so dope that we are experiencing what the early church did, and that we're not limited by what's going on. Like, we have more resources than they ever had, and yet we're, like, doing it the same way, like church in our houses. Okay, so we're going to land this plane soon, I promise. Paul then instructs the Colossians that when this letter is read to them, that it needs to also be read to the church in Laodicea. So 2 things about that. This tells us that Paul's letters were written to be shared aloud publicly to the audience or the crowd. And it was a way for him to teach to the church even though he couldn't personally be there with them, right? Which is literally exactly like how Ben and Jim record a message from wherever they are, because they cannot be with us physically to teach to us in a room. And so again, like, the parallels were so cool of him writing a letter that's going to be read aloud, and Jim and Ben recording a video that's going to be played and streamed into thousands of homes across the world. And then secondly, he tells them to read the letter to encourage the church in the neighboring town. So it would kind of be like us sharing one of Ben or Jim's talks with Red Rocks Church, like down the road. And I love that we see Paul's heart to share this message with all and not being in competition with other churches. And we've talked a lot about that lately too at Flatirons, that we should be working together as churches in Colorado and encouraging and helping one another instead of competing. I think we've done a really good job with that in these last few months, and I'm excited to continue partnering with other churches. And then right before he signs the letter, Paul has a very special message for this guy, Archippus. So Archippus is thought to be potentially he was Philemon's son, and perhaps the pastor of the church in Laodicea. But either way, he's obviously really important to Paul, because Paul, right before he finishes the letter, is like, wait, I have a message for this guy. So Paul instructs the Colossians to find Archippus and tell him to fulfill the ministry that he has received in the Lord. He's telling them to encourage this guy who clearly has been called by God to do something for the kingdom. Paul somehow knew that this guy would need to be spurred on to fulfill his ministry calling and to keep going. And he's asking the people around him to do this. He's not saying it directly to Archippus. He's saying, hey guys, like, go encourage this guy. Go remind him that he's been called to something really special, and like encourage him to fulfill that and keep going. Because encouragement always just means more when it comes from your people, right? People that you love and trust. And some of you guys have done that, just by the way, for us over these last couple months, checking on us and encouraging us and giving us strength to keep fighting this fight in ministry right now. So thank you. Like, it means more than you know, and it keeps us going. So thank those of you who have been doing that. Paul ends this letter by taking the pen or quill or whatever they used from the hand of whomever was writing it on his behalf. So typically he would dictate his letters and someone would write what he was saying. But he takes the pen out of the guy's hand, and he signs it with his own hand. And he says, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. And he says, remember my chains. Grace be with you. Amen. And you can almost feel the emotion in those 3 words, remember my chains. Paul doesn't know how any of this is going to end, right? He's sitting in prison waiting for his appeal, unsure of if or when he's going to be free again and allowed out of his cell. I think so many of us can relate to that. Like, we thought we knew when this was going to be over, and then it wasn't. And the dates have continued to be pushed back or changed, or the rules are changing. And so Paul's sitting in this place of like, I don't know if I'm getting out of here, you guys. I don't know how this is going to end. But he's asking them to remember him and to pray for him and to realize that, like, remember my chains. Like, choosing life with Jesus comes at a cost. It costs you a lot, and it's not easy, but it's really worth it. Why? Like, why is it worth it? And he says it right here. He ends it with, grace be with you. Grace with us. Like, all of the loss and suffering and difficulty is worth the gift that is grace through what Jesus did on the cross. And he ties everything up. He has said in Colossians, like everything he said in Colossians, he ties it up so perfectly by reminding them of grace. It's not about works. It's not about how much you can do and striving to be perfect and upholding every letter of the law without mistake. It's grace. Like, it's the only reason we're here. It's the only reason I'm sitting in this prison cell writing to you with joy and love and like concerned about you, is because of grace. So much like those stories that your sweet senile grandpa tells you that seem to be just a running list of names that you don't recognize, we could actually learn so much from those stories. And so I'm just going to leave you with these challenges that I took from these short verses. Prayer. Who needs you to pray for them right now? And a lot of times I know I say, I'll be praying for you, but we never actually stop and pray specifically for those people and for their specific circumstances. And So I just challenge you to commit to praying for those people who need that this week, and you know who those people are. Secondly, who do you need to reconcile with and move on from past offenses or differences in opinions or beliefs? Dan challenged, I was already planning to challenge y'all with that, and Dan challenged us yesterday with it, and I think there's probably someone who needed to be reminded twice. Like, we need to hear it twice before it really sinks in. And so maybe it's taking the first step to make things right with that person. And lastly, how can you encourage people in your life right now? Maybe it's in your own family. Maybe your husband is struggling with not going to work, and that's his whole identity. His whole purpose has been to provide for you and your family. And now that we're not going to work, he's struggling. Like, could you encourage him in that? Or maybe it's your single mom neighbor who feels like she's just failing her kids left and right and can't do it all. Or maybe it's your church staff, like we see in these scriptures. Like, maybe it's someone on your church staff who needs to be reminded that, like, this calling, this ministry is making a difference and it matters. But whatever that is, encourage somebody this week. All right, I'm done. I honestly never imagined I could learn so much or talk so much just about a list of names. But I miss you guys so freaking much. We'll be back tomorrow to tie a bow on Colossians and kind of fill you in on what we've got coming next for you. So I love you guys so much. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.